Welcome to Unwrap Reality, where we narrate stories on things that happen in real life.
What happens when the person you trusted most in the world betrays you without even having the decency to say it to your face? Imagine waking up one morning, scrolling through your phone, and finding a text message ending your marriage. No explanation. No apology. Just cold words on a screen that feel like they've ripped your heart out. That's exactly what happened to me. My name is Lisa, and this isn't just a story about betrayal. It's about survival, resilience, and turning pain into power. It wasn't just the divorce by text that crushed me. It was what came next. Hours after receiving that life-altering message, I discovered something far worse. Our joint bank account, everything we'd built together over 5 years, was empty. Every penny gone. And the man I thought loved me? He didn't even have the guts to tell me himself. At first, all I could do was sit there in stunned silence, staring at my phone as if it might suddenly rewrite reality. But then something inside me shifted. Anger bubbled up where despair had taken root, and I realized I wasn't going to let him destroy me. Not without a fight. That text message didn't just end my marriage. It shattered everything I thought I knew about trust, love, and fairness. Let me paint you a picture of who I was before that day. My name is Lisa, and up until then, I considered myself one of the lucky ones. Sure, life wasn't perfect, but it was good. I had a stable job as an event planner, a cozy little apartment filled with memories we'd built together, and a husband who promised forever. At least, that's what I believed. Looking back now, I can see the cracks in our relationship. The late nights he claimed were work-related, the way his tone changed when talking about finances, but at the time, I convinced myself it was normal. After all, every couple has their ups and downs, right? Then came that morning. I remember sitting on the edge of my bed, still half asleep, scrolling through my phone like any other day. And there it was, a notification from him, plain and impersonal. I think it's best if we go our separate ways. I'll handle the paperwork. No explanation. No conversation. Just 6 words that felt like they'd been written by a stranger instead of the man I'd shared my life with for 5 years. At first, I thought it was some kind of sick joke. But deep down, I knew better. Before I could even process what I'd read, panic set in. Something didn't feel right, like a gut instinct screaming at me to check our accounts. And that's when the second blow hit. With trembling hands, I logged into our joint bank account, the one we used for rent, groceries, bills, everything, and found it completely drained. $0. Gone. Every last penny. Even the emergency fund we swore we'd never touch was empty. It wasn't just betrayal. It was theft. In an instant, I went from feeling heartbroken to absolutely furious. Who does something like this? How could someone be so callous, so cruel? As I sat there staring at the screen, tears streaming down my face, I realized 2 things. First, I'd underestimated how far he would go to hurt me. And second, I wasn't going to let him get away with it, not without a fight. The days that followed were a blur of anger, confusion, and sleepless nights. I oscillated between wanting to scream at the top of my lungs and curling into a ball, convinced I'd never recover from this betrayal. But somewhere in the chaos, something inside me began to shift. Maybe it was pride, or maybe it was sheer stubbornness, but I refused to let him win. Not like this. This wasn't just about money. It was about respect, dignity, and proving to myself that I was stronger than he thought. So instead of wallowing, I started digging. If he could be ruthless, so could I. My first step? Research. I spent hours combing through old emails, bank statements, and anything else I could find that might give me answers. At first, I didn't know what I was looking for. Proof of his infidelity? Clues about where the money had gone? Anything to make sense of the mess he'd left behind. Then I stumbled across something strange. Transactions labeled with names I didn't recognize. They weren't huge amounts individually, but together they added up to thousands. Something about them felt off. It was subtle, almost invisible unless you were really paying attention, but there it was, a trail leading somewhere darker than I'd imagined. That's when the idea hit me. If these transactions pointed to shady dealings, and I was willing to bet they did, I could use them against him. Not out of spite, but because he needed to pay for what he'd done. Not just to me, but potentially to others too. The more I thought about it, the clearer my path became. I wouldn't just sit back and let him ruin me. I'd turn the tables on him in a way he'd never see coming. For the first time since that fateful text message, I felt a flicker of hope. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about justice. And I was ready to play dirty. With the pieces starting to fall into place, I knew I couldn't go after him blindly. Revenge, or justice if you want to call it that, requires precision, strategy, and nerves of steel. So I sat down and mapped out a plan, one step at a time. First, I needed access to his world, his secrets, and most importantly, his ego. He always had a weakness for flattery, for people who made him feel important. That's when I decided to play the role he'd least expect, the desperate ex-wife clinging to hope. It wasn't just about getting close to him again. It was about making him lower his guard enough to let me in. I started small, sending carefully crafted messages designed to reel him in. "I don't understand why this is happening," I wrote, letting vulnerability seep through every word. "Can we talk? Please." At first, he ignored me completely, but I didn't give up. I kept pushing, alternating between sadness and subtle hints of anger until finally, he responded. His reply was cold, almost dismissive, but there was a flicker of curiosity beneath the surface. I could practically hear the gears turning in his head. Does she still care? Could she be useful? Little did he know I was already 10 steps ahead. As I gained more access to his life, I began gathering evidence. Not just financial records, but anything that might expose the truth about who he really was. Every text, email, or casual conversation became a potential weapon in my arsenal. But I had to tread carefully. One wrong move, one slip-up, and he'd see right through me. The stakes were higher than ever, but so was my determination. This wasn't just a game anymore. It was war. And as I pieced together the puzzle of his lies, I realized something else. I wasn't just fighting for myself. I was fighting for everyone he'd hurt, everyone he thought he could walk all over without consequence. By the time I was ready to strike, I knew I wouldn't just take him down, I'd make sure he stayed down. Getting back into his inner circle wasn't easy, but I played my part perfectly. I let him think I was broken, vulnerable, and desperate to win him back. The key was balancing authenticity with manipulation, making him believe I still cared while secretly gathering everything I needed to destroy him. It started with harmless texts, then phone calls where I pretended to cry, begging for answers he never gave. Slowly but surely, he began opening up, not out of kindness, but because it fed his ego. He loved the idea that I couldn't live without him, that I was willing to grovel. What he didn't realize was that every word he said, every careless detail he dropped, brought me closer to exposing the truth. Once I had his attention, I took the next step, meeting in person. I convinced him we needed closure, framing it as a final attempt to salvage something from the wreckage of our marriage. He agreed reluctantly, probably thinking it would be an easy way to shut me up once and for all. But when we met at a quiet cafe downtown, I turned on the charm. I laughed at his jokes, complimented his suit, and acted like the devoted wife he'd always wanted me to be, at least on the surface. Underneath, I was studying him, watching for cracks in his polished facade. Over coffee, he casually mentioned a business trip he was taking later that week, of a big deal he hinted would change everything for him. That's when I knew I was onto something bigger than I'd anticipated. The deeper I dug, the more dangerous his world became. During one of our chance encounters, I overheard him talking to someone about offshore accounts and shady investors. At first, I thought I'd imagined it, but the more I listened, the clearer it became. This wasn't just about hiding money, it was about laundering it. My stomach churned at the thought of how far his greed had taken him, but I couldn't afford to hesitate. Every document I photocopied, every conversation I recorded, and every lie I told pushed me further into his orbit, and closer to bringing him down. Still, the risks were mounting. If he caught me, there was no telling what he might do. But fear wasn't an option anymore. I'd come too far to turn back now. Things started moving faster than I'd expected, and with speed came danger. One evening, while sneaking through his office, posing as a courier delivering documents, I nearly got caught. I was crouched behind his desk, scanning files onto a USB drive, when I heard the doorknob turn. My heart stopped. For a split second, I thought it was over, that he'd walked in and found me red-handed. But instead, it was just his assistant, dropping off some papers before heading home. She didn't even glance toward the desk where I sat frozen, invisible in the dim light. When she left, I exhaled so hard my hands shook. That close call made one thing painfully clear: I couldn't keep operating on the edge like this forever. Sooner or later, luck would run out. But quitting wasn't an option, not now, not when I was so close to unraveling the full picture. The more I uncovered, the darker his web became. There were shell companies, fake invoices, and transactions tied to names I recognized from news reports about corruption scandals. It wasn't just illegal, it was dangerous. These weren't small-time crooks. They were players in a much larger game, and my husband was neck-deep in their schemes. Every new piece of evidence felt heavier, like holding dynamite with a lit fuse. And yet, I couldn't stop. Each discovery gave me fuel to keep going, to push harder despite the mounting risks. But the pressure was relentless. Some nights, I barely slept, jumping at every sound outside my apartment, convinced someone was watching me. Then came the moment that almost broke me. While digging through encrypted emails he'd carelessly left open on his laptop, I stumbled across something chilling: a message thread discussing loose ends. At first, I thought it was metaphorical business jargon, but the context hit me like a freight train. They weren't talking about unfinished deals, they were talking about people. People who knew too much. Suddenly, I realized I wasn't just playing a game of cat and mouse, I was dancing with predators. If they found out what I was doing, I wouldn't just lose this fight, I might not survive it. Yet, strangely, that realization didn't scare me into stopping. Instead, it ignited something fierce inside me. I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore, I was fighting for anyone else he might hurt if I let him walk away scot-free. The moment of truth arrived sooner than I expected, but when it did, I was ready, armed with a mountain of evidence. Emails, transaction records, voice recordings. I knew exactly what I had to do. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place during one of our fake reconciliation meetings. He sat across from me at a swanky restaurant, smug as ever, boasting about how his new business venture would make him millions. It was almost laughable, the way he thought he was untouchable. What he didn't know was that I'd already forwarded every shred of evidence to an investigative journalist friend of mine. By the time dessert hit the table, my trap was set, and he was walking right into it. I'll never forget the look on his face when the authorities showed up. One minute, he was sipping his overpriced wine, acting like the king of the world. The next, two detectives were standing beside our table, flashing badges and reading him his rights. His jaw dropped, his eyes darted around the room, and for the first time since I'd met him, he looked truly scared. As they let him out in handcuffs, I stayed seated, calm and composed, watching the spectacle unfold. People whispered and stared, but none of that mattered to me. All I could think about was the weight lifting off my shoulders, the sense of justice finally being served. For years, he'd treated me like I was nothing, disposable. Now, he was the one exposed, humiliated, and powerless. But the victory wasn't just personal, it was bigger than both of us. Within days, the story exploded in the media. Reporters dug deeper into his dealings, uncovering even more corruption than I'd imagined. Investors pulled out, partners cut ties, and his once thriving empire crumbled overnight. Watching the fallout from afar, I felt a strange mix of emotions: relief, satisfaction, and even pity. Not because I cared about him anymore, but because seeing someone self-destruct is never easy, even when they deserve it. Still, I reminded myself why I'd done this. Not for revenge, but for fairness. Justice isn't always swift or perfect, but in this case, it worked. And as I walked away from the wreckage of our shared past, I knew I'd earned the right to start fresh. In the weeks that followed, I found myself reflecting on everything I'd been through and how much I'd changed. The Lisa who received that cold text message months ago felt like a stranger now. Back then, I was lost, vulnerable, and unsure of my own strength. But the woman I'd become? She was unshakable. This journey hadn't just taught me about betrayal, It had shown me what I was capable of when pushed to my limits. For the first time in years, I didn't feel defined by someone else's choices or their cruelty. I realized something important. He didn't break me. If anything, he made me stronger. With the dust settling, I decided to focus on rebuilding, not just financially, but emotionally. I rented a small studio apartment, far away from the life we'd shared, and started over completely. It wasn't easy at first. There were days when loneliness crept in, reminders of all I'd lost. But slowly, I began rediscovering pieces of myself I thought were gone forever. The ambitious planner, the creative dreamer, the fighter who refused to give up. I threw myself into work, taking on projects that challenged me and reignited my passion for event planning. And for the first time, I invested in me, cooking classes, weekend hikes, even painting lessons. Life wasn't perfect, but it was mine, and that made all the difference. Looking back now, I see this experience as both a curse and a gift. Yes, it left scars, some deeper than others, but it also gave me clarity. I learned that resilience isn't about bouncing back. It's about growing forward, no matter how hard the fall. If there's one thing I want you to take away from my story, it's this. Sometimes, the worst moments in life can lead to the best versions of ourselves. So if you're sitting there thinking you'll never recover from your own heartbreak or betrayal, trust me, you will. You might not realize it yet, but you're stronger than you think. Now, here's my question for you. What's the hardest lesson life has taught you, and how did it shape who you are today? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear your story.